You lift the glass. Before anything else happens, you notice the smell. Sharp, a little sweet, a little rotten underneath it all. You don't remember consciously deciding to reach for it. Somewhere between one thought and the next, your hand was already moving, the way it always is by this point in the evening. Then you drink. Your judgment slows, just slightly, just enough. Your worries get quieter, not gone, just further away, like someone turned down the volume on a conversation happening in another room. The room feels warmer, even though nothing in the room has actually changed. Not the temperature, not the light, nothing except the chemistry running through you right now. You already know with total certainty that you'll feel worse for this tomorrow. You're going to do it again anyway. Tonight, more than 2 billion people on this planet will do the exact same thing you're doing right now. On purpose, for no nutritional reason at all, in nearly every country on Earth. That should strike you as strange. It doesn't, and it never has, because we didn't invent this behavior. We inherited it, fully formed, from something that couldn't even stand upright yet. Alcohol is legal in almost every country on Earth. It carries no nutritional purpose whatsoever. In fact, it actually costs your body real energy just to break it down and clear it out of your system. And yet humans have organized entire economies around it. Entire religions. Entire calendars of ritual and celebration. All built around getting deliberately, temporarily impaired. So here's the real question worth sitting with. At what point did what started as an accident become something close to a universal human tradition? Because it absolutely did start as an accident. Long before there were humans capable of asking that question, there was fruit. And long before anyone was choosing to ferment anything on purpose, there was simply fruit that had already gone bad, sitting on the ground, waiting to be found by something that hadn't yet learned to be cautious about it. Roughly 10 million years ago, long before anything resembling a human existed, a distant ancestor shared by humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas picked up a strange, tiny genetic mutation. It was a small change to an enzyme called ADH4, one of the tools the body uses to break alcohol down into something harmless. That single mutation made this ancestor's body around 40 times more efficient at processing ethanol than its close relatives. Researchers who identified this mutation believe it appeared right around the time our ancestors were shifting away from a life spent almost entirely in the trees and spending more and more time down on the forest floor instead, which happens to be exactly where fermenting fruit accumulates after it falls and starts to rot in the heat and moisture. Think about what that shift actually meant day to day. Up in the canopy, fruit is fresh, still on the branch, still exactly as sweet as the tree intended it to be. Down on the ground, fruit has been sitting for days, sometimes weeks, softening, breaking down, quietly fermenting in the heat. Most animals avoid that stuff instinctively. The smell alone signals spoiled, unsafe. Skip it. But an ancestor who happened to carry this one mutation could eat it safely, without getting sick, without losing coordination in a way that mattered out in the open, where predators were watching. Natural selection, in other words, didn't punish the ancestor who could tolerate rotten fruit. It rewarded them, generation after generation, with an entire extra food source nobody else in the family tree could safely access, especially during lean seasons when fresh fruit on the branch was scarce and the fallen, fermenting kind was often all that was left on the ground. Alcohol tolerance isn't some modern indulgence layered on top of an otherwise clean biology. It's a genuine 10-million-year-old survival adaptation, quietly built into you before your own species even existed to inherit it, refined over roughly 400,000 generations before the first Natufian ever soaked a single grain of barley. Fast forward to Göbekli Tepe, in what is now southeastern Turkey, a massive complex of carved stone pillars built roughly 11,500 years ago, before agriculture, before pottery, before permanent villages, as far as archaeologists can currently tell. Buried among the ruins are enormous stone vats, some large enough to hold over 100 liters at once. Residue analysis pulled from similar vessels found across the region shows starch and oxalate traces consistent with fermenting grain into a rough, beer-like drink. Some archaeologists now argue something that used to sound almost absurd when it was first proposed: that early humans may have started deliberately cultivating wild grain, not primarily to grind it into bread, but specifically to brew it. Consider the practical math involved. Wild einkorn wheat, the specific grain found near Göbekli Tepe, produces a fairly modest yield when gathered by hand, barely worth the walking distance most seasons. But run that same modest yield to a fermentation process, and you get something calorically dense, mood-altering, and valuable enough to justify building massive stone monuments specifically to consume it in groups. If that idea holds up, then the concept of getting drunk together as a community might actually be older than farming itself, older than settled village life, older than almost anything else we typically associate with the birth of civilization. We didn't build civilization first and then stumble onto beer as a reward for our progress. There's a real, evidence-backed case that we built the earliest version of civilization, specifically chasing it. Stone pillar by stone pillar, vat by vat. In the highlands overlooking the eastern Mediterranean, a cave called Raqefet held onto its secret for roughly 13,000 years before archaeologists finally found it. Inside, they discovered stone mortars carved directly into the bedrock floor, and inside those mortars, residue consistent with malted grain that had been deliberately soaked and allowed to sprout, which is the very first essential step of brewing beer. This wasn't accidental fermentation, left to chance the way it might have happened in the wild. This was a deliberate, multi-step process, repeated with intention. And it wasn't happening in isolation, often some separate corner of daily life either. The mortars were found placed directly alongside human burials, strongly suggesting the drink was brewed specifically for funeral feasts, timed to a very particular kind of grief. Getting an entire community deliberately, intentionally drunk together, on purpose, specifically to help mark and process the death of someone they loved. That is one of the oldest confirmed alcoholic rituals we currently have direct physical evidence for anywhere on Earth. And it's tied, from the very beginning, to something as universally human as mourning. Researchers examining the mortars found wear patterns consistent with repeated, long-term use, not a single one-off event, meaning this wasn't an isolated experiment that happened once and was never repeated. It was a practiced, refined technique passed down and reused across multiple burials over an extended period, exactly the kind of repetition you'd expect from a ritual the community had come to genuinely rely on. Halfway around the world, and roughly 9,000 years ago, villagers at a site called Jiahu, in what is now central China, were sealing a fermented drink made from rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit into clay jars, entirely unaware that anyone in the Fertile Crescent was doing anything remotely similar at the exact same time. Chemical residue pulled directly from inside those jars confirms it beyond doubt. This makes Jiahu one of the earliest chemically verified alcoholic beverages ever discovered anywhere on the planet. Developed completely independently, with no contact, no shared trade route, no possible cultural transmission between the two regions. Different continent, different grain, different culture, different language, different gods, entirely different worldview, and yet somehow the exact same underlying idea arrived at twice by two groups of people who would never know the other existed. When something shows up independently in two completely unconnected places within a few thousand years of each other, it stops looking like an interesting coincidence and starts looking a lot more like something closer to a shared human instinct. quietly running in the background no matter where on the map you happen to be standing. Chemists who analyzed the Jiahu residue found tartaric acid, a compound that reliably signals fruit fermentation, alongside beeswax markers pointing to the honey, giving researchers enough confidence to reconstruct the recipe almost exactly. Rice for body, honey for sweetness, and yeast activity, hawthorn fruit for tartness and color. It's a completely different formula from anything brewing in the Fertile Crescent at the same moment, built from whatever ingredients happen to be locally available, arriving at a strikingly similar destination anyway. Picture the evening it actually happened, in whatever version of it played out at Raqefet all those thousands of years ago. The sun is going down over the highlands, painting everything in long shadow. The mortars have been filled with grain and water for days now, left to sprout, then crushed by hand, then left again until the mixture turns cloudy and starts to smell faintly sweet and sharp at the exact same time. A smell nobody in that camp has a word for yet. Someone notices the change first. They lean in closer, cautious, curious, and decide to taste it anyway. Despite having no idea what to expect, word spreads through the small camp quickly, the way everything spread back then. Not written down anywhere, just passed person to person, voice to voice, around the fire. By nightfall, a small crowd has gathered close together. Cups, or whatever crude vessel served as one, get passed hand to hand. The first sip makes a few people wince, faces twisting at the unfamiliar sharpness. The second sip makes almost everyone visibly relax, shoulders dropping, postures loosening. Conversation gets louder, easier, less guarded than it was an hour ago. Someone starts telling a story about a person the group lost recently, and for the first time in days, people find themselves laughing along with the grief, instead of only sitting quietly inside it, carrying it alone. Nobody in that circle has a single word yet for alcohol. They don't know anything about ADH4, or fermentation chemistry, or what a blood alcohol level even means. All they know, the only thing that actually matters to them in that moment, is that this strange new drink makes the night feel different. And different right now, tonight, is exactly what every person in that circle desperately needed. Someone will remember this night, imperfectly, and describe it to someone else weeks later who will try to recreate it, get the ratio slightly wrong, wait the wrong number of days, and stumble onto a slightly different result entirely by accident. That's how this technique actually spreads in a world with no written instructions, not as a fixed recipe, but as a story, retold and reattempted. Refined a little more each time someone gets it wrong in an interesting direction. Here's the turn. For most of human history up to this point, wild grain simply wasn't worth the effort it took to farm. It grew scattered thin across the landscape. The yield from gathering it by hand was small, and the labor barely justified the calories you got back out of it. But brewing changes that entire equation, almost overnight. A modest harvest of ordinary wild grain, once properly fermented, produces something valuable enough that people become willing to plant it deliberately, tend it patiently through a full season, and defend it from animals and rival groups, year after year after year. Some researchers now argue early humans didn't domesticate grain primarily because they were hungry for bread. They domesticated it because they wanted more beer, more reliably, more often than nature alone was ever going to provide it. Villages slowly grew up around those newly planted fields. Storage of surplus grain led to genuine ownership for the first time. And ownership led directly to the very first real arguments over exactly who owned what and how much of it. Centuries later in ancient Egypt, beer wasn't treated as some rare luxury item. It functioned as actual currency. The laborers who physically built the pyramids at Giza were paid in it, several liters delivered every single day, partly as raw calories to fuel the labor, partly as pure incentive to keep showing up. We didn't build civilization first, and then happen to discover a taste for alcohol as a nice reward afterward. There's a genuinely serious case to be made that we built the earliest scaffolding of civilization itself while actively chasing it. Historians studying Egyptian labor records have found ration lists specifying beer allotments by role and rank. A stonecutter received a different daily amount than a scribe overseeing the work, and both received more than an unskilled laborer hauling stone. That's not casual drinking. That's a functioning wage system, with alcohol sitting at the center of it, thousands of years before coined currency existed anywhere in the region. You pour a drink at the end of a hard week and call it relaxing. They brewed one at the end of a hard season and called it survival math. Plain and simple. You drink to quiet a mind that never quite stops moving on its own. They drank to make a grief-heavy night just barely bearable enough to get through, until morning came. You treat your own alcohol tolerance as a minor genetic quirk, a small party trick your body happens to be reasonably good at. They built entire economies, entire funeral rites, entire early village structures on top of that exact same 10-million-year-old mutation, without ever knowing it existed, without a single word for the chemistry underneath it. You think you're simply choosing to get a drink tonight, weighing it out, deciding freely. In a very real, very literal sense, something deep inside you decided this 10 million years before you were ever born. Back when the closest thing to a human being anywhere on Earth couldn't even stand up fully straight yet, and had already quietly learned that the rotten fruit lying on the ground was worth the risk every single time. Every single time you've ever raised a glass at a wedding, toasted a promotion, or simply poured one at the end of a long, ordinary Tuesday, you've been unknowingly participating in a behavior with a paper trail stretching back through Egyptian wage records, through a cave full of funeral mortars, through a stone temple built before anyone had invented the wheel, all the way back to a single mutated enzyme in a creature that never once stood fully upright. This has been Foxholes. Stories from the Foxholes. If tonight's drink tastes just a little different now that you know exactly where it came from, that's precisely the point.